Hey friends, Chad Stanton here, and this is Healthy, Fit, and Poor. Today is a very special episode because it's actually one of my first episodes with actual content that's going to be credible, relatable, and usable. And today we are going to talk about creating motivation. And yes, that's exactly right, I said creating motivation. Throughout my years of coaching, I have come to realize that there is a million different misconceptions as to what motivation actually is and how it kind of relates to the humans themselves. One of the biggest misconceptions, I believe, is people tend to believe that motivation is some resource that the universe just magically bestows upon us at its own will. Quite the opposite. Motivation is simply a byproduct of habit. So when people tend to think that they are just lacking motivation, it's a little true, but not necessarily the truth. When in reality, what they're actually lacking is habitual consistency. So before I go any further and break down the cycle of motivation, I think it's paramountly important that we talk about the MVP of motivation itself, dopamine. Have you heard of it? If you haven't heard of dopamine, you might remember it from its other roles in happiness, focus, alertness, love. I think the most important thing to know is how powerful dopamine can actually be for a human being and how dopamine is associated with some of the most intense emotions a human being can experience. So now we're going to turn to this clever illustration that I've conjured up so I can best demonstrate how the cycle of motivation can actually be achieved. The first thing is we need to go through and we need to address and understand all the variables that need to be at play in order for this to happen. The first variable is going to be the human. In this case, it's Dorothy, and I've chosen her as an assistant because Dorothy is just your average woman who probably spends too much time on Instagram. The second factor we need to explore and talk about are going to be our environmental cues. And so in this case, I've drawn a cell phone with a little box in it for the screen with an S and M representing social media. The next variable we're going to talk about is IDR, which represents initial dopamine response, or what I like to call it, our call to action. So what I mean by that is when a human experiences this initial dopamine response, I largely like to associate it with the word should. That's usually an indication where someone all of a sudden feels inclined to change. I should go to the gym. I should go back to yoga. I should eat more vegetables. So now we're going to explore variable number 4. Is a dumbbell and an apple, as you can tell. The dumbbell and the apple are going to represent exercise, eating healthy. Lastly, and probably most importantly, is this DR cubed. What that actually represents is our dopamine response for reward and reinforcement. The initial dopamine response happens in anticipation of a much larger dopamine response for reward and reinforcement. One thing to note is in order for any dopamine response to happen, Dorothy needs to have an association. So the best thing to make associations with are usually habitual or behaviors. So Dorothy has associated exercising and eating healthy with this dopamine reward. Our lovely Dorothy is currently sitting at home. She's scrolling through social media. She happens to see a picture of one of her friends who's made some crazy transformation. Dorothy then gets that initial dopamine response, or better known for that call to action. And most importantly, when that call to action happens, Dorothy seizes it and she acts. Because that call to action is fleeting at best. And that call to action is all the motivation we're going to get in the very beginning. Dorothy goes to the gym, she starts eating better. Dorothy then gets this dopamine jackpot. Now this jackpot, what I said earlier, represents dopamine response for reward and reinforcement. So Dorothy is getting the dopamine response to reward this behavior and to reinforce the environmental cue and to reinforce that initial dopamine response. Now, the more Dorothy can actually perform this cycle, the easier the cycle is going to get. Also to note, The more environmental cues Dorothy can engineer in her favor to inspire this cycle, the easier it's going to be for her to adhere to the habits and behaviors at hand. Okay, lastly, we're going to run through this scenario just one last time, very quickly. Bear with me. The scenario is going to be completely similar. The only difference is the association Dorothy has made is not with a behavior or habit. Instead, it's going to be with a goal. In this case, it's to lose 15 pounds. Dorothy's scrolling through social media. She gets that initial dopamine response. She responds to the call of action. She goes to the gym and she eats healthy. Here's the issue. Dorothy goes to the gym one time. She's trying to establish a habit of going to the gym. Dorothy eats healthy one time. She's trying to establish a habit of eating healthy. Is Dorothy going to lose 15 pounds after going to the gym once and eating healthy once? No. Therefore, wouldn't it be safe to say that Dorothy is probably not going to get this dopamine response jackpot, which is going to reward the behavior and reinforce the environmental cues? Absolutely. Now, you've been listening to me rant and rave about the cycle of motivation. If there's absolutely only one thing that you can take away from this video, please, please, please let it be this. When in life you find and you experience that call to action, that initial dopamine response, act now. Don't wait until tomorrow. Don't wait until next week. This motivation is going to be fleeting. You don't know when it's going to happen again. Now, before I wrap this up, I just wanted to make very clearly that the objective of this episode was to illustrate how we can use consistent habits to perpetuate motivation in our lives. However, in the episodes to come, I'm going to cover how we can best implement strategies and systems to develop habits and behavior change that's going to allow us to get engulfed in the motivation cycle. If there's anything on the subject you need a little bit more clarity on, please reach out to me on Instagram at healthyfitandpoor or tweet me on Twitter at fitpoor. If you found any of this information remotely helpful or applicable, please click that like button. Be sure to subscribe to my channel and turn on any notification so you can stay up to date when my new content comes out every week.